And welcome back to Sunday Square Off. A new survey of Valley residents shows surprising support for drastic solutions to deal with our historic drought. The survey by ASU's Decision Center for a Desert City asked Phoenix residents what they would do to conserve water. 65% would cut their water usage by a quarter, just 15% were opposed. 43% are okay with treating wastewater for use as drinking water. 33% didn't like the taste of that. And 38% would import water supplies versus 31% who oppose it. That's what citizens would do. The big question now is, what will our leaders do to assure we have water well into the future? Dave, you worked on that study, hasn't formally been released yet. 65% say they would cut their water use. That goes against the prevailing mantra of, oh, we're not California, we're not going to have to do that. What do you make of that result?
Well, first of all, we should note that Arizonans in the Central Valley, in the central part of the state, in the valley, have considerably cut their water demand over the last 2 decades. The city of Phoenix, for instance, cut water demand by about 25% over a 15-year period. So we've done some very effective conservation. The results of our survey show that people are willing to contribute to an overall demand reduction of another 25% to address the critical shortages that we face. And so this demonstrates a willingness of people to contribute to collective solutions on the demand management side, which is much more effective, cheaper, and more efficient than importing new supplies.
So if government said, you know what, we need you to cut back, you think residents would go along?
And in the survey, we framed the question to suggest that this will have personal impacts on you as a resident and your communities, and people still expressed that level of support. So we do believe that there is fairly strong support for demand management and broad-based conservation across all sectors in our region.
And this question about using wastewater for drinking water, Sandy, I think you and I have talked about that in the past. It's, you're really onto how much we waste water here. How much does that surprise you? I'm stunned by that.
I think that number has changed from where it was some years ago, and it tells me that people are more informed about water, as does their reaction relative to making those cutbacks. And you know, people, if they have good information and they have the tools and the information on how to make changes, they will do it. And so, yeah, I think it's encouraging to see that people in Phoenix are willing to do more to save water and avoid the costly impacts of importing it.
Now, I know if the City of Phoenix's water director were sitting here, she'd probably say, look, we have plenty of water banked underground or through other means to keep us going, provided well into the future. Does anything you've said here today conflict with the city's position that there is plenty of water to go around?
Well, I think there's a lot of water that has been banked, but to say that we shouldn't be doing more to conserve and shouldn't be looking at ways to avoid importing more water would be ridiculous. And again, we can't just be thinking about Phoenix, because what Phoenix does impacts the rest of the valley and the rest of the state. And I can tell you, I was in Safford not too long ago, and they think people in Phoenix have all kinds of golf courses and fake lakes while they're being told to cut back their water. So I think we need to really think about that.
And there is a big rural-urban divide on this, and that takes us to the discussions for a larger settlement, how Arizona is going to manage water on our own and as with the western states. Governor Ducey was supposed to bring legislation up this year to help do that. That hasn't happened. The Bureau of Reclamation says that needs to happen now. Dave, give us a top line on that. What is going on in that area to help all the western states and Arizona on its own agree on how to use water?
Well, what we're talking about here generally is called the Drought Contingency Planning Process, known in Arizona as the DCP+. Now, what we've seen is a sense of urgency initially in the drought contingency planning process that was abated somewhat when we had a more wet winter 2 years ago. That urgency sort of diminished. That urgency is back now.
So one winter and we're okay, and now one bad winter and things not okay.
Exactly, and this is why we need to be thinking long term. The City of Phoenix, working along with the State Department of Water Resources, the Central Arizona Project, and the other stakeholders in the region, need to be more aware of the regional perspective and the fact that we will sink or swim on this issue together, and that no one will be effective in developing solutions individually.